remember the cold first? Not the kind that makes you shiver and stamp your feet, but the kind that reaches inside your chest and wraps itself around your heart until you can't tell the difference between being cold and being afraid. It was January 1951, somewhere in the mountains north of Seoul, and we'd been dug in for 3 days without relief. The ground was frozen solid. The sky was white, and between us and the Chinese positions across the valley, there was nothing but silence and snow and the kind of stillness that makes you forget there's supposed to be a war happening at all. I was 22 years old. My name was Private First Class Robert Marsh, and I'd been in Korea for 7 months, long enough to know that nothing about this war made sense anymore. We'd push forward, then fall back, win a hill, lose it the next day, fight for ground that didn't have a name, then abandon it when the orders came through. But that morning, none of that mattered. What mattered was that I was hungry and cold and sitting in a foxhole with a man I barely knew, watching smoke rise from a can of beans I'd heated over a makeshift fire. That's when it happened, the thing that would change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it really began. The night before, we'd heard movement in the valley below. Not much, just enough to know they were out there, shifting positions, probably as miserable as we were. Lieutenant Crawford had ordered us to hold fire unless we had a clear target. No point wasting ammunition on shadows, he said. No point giving away our position for nothing. So we waited. That's what war becomes after a while. Not the fighting, but the waiting. The long hours between one moment of terror and the next, when you're left alone with your thoughts and the cold and the faces of the men around you, wondering who'll still be there when the sun comes up. The soldier in my foxhole was named Chen. He was Chinese-American, born in San Francisco, and he'd caught hell for it since the day he arrived. Some of the guys couldn't separate him from the enemy we were fighting. I'd seen them turn their backs when he spoke, heard them mutter things they thought he couldn't hear. Danny never said much about it. He just kept his head down and did his job, which was more than could be said for some of the loudest patriots in our unit. That night, Danny was quiet. He usually was. He sat with his rifle across his knees, staring out at the darkness, his breath making small clouds in the frozen air. I wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, but I couldn't think of words that wouldn't sound stupid or empty. So I just sat there with him, listening to the wind and the distant sound of ice cracking on the trees. Around midnight I heard it, a voice faint, barely there, coming from somewhere down in the valley. It wasn't English, but it wasn't Chinese either. It took me a moment to realize it was someone singing, a low, mournful sound that drifted up through the darkness like smoke. Danny heard it too. He tilted his head, listening. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," Danny said. "Korean, maybe, or I'm not sure." We listened together, and for a few minutes the war disappeared. There was just that voice, rising and falling, full of something I couldn't name. Sadness, maybe, or longing, the kind of sound that makes you think about home, even if you're not sure where home is anymore. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before. "Do you ever wonder," Danny said quietly, "what they're thinking over there?" "Who?" "Them, the Chinese. The North Koreans, whoever's out there in the cold, same as us." I didn't answer right away. It was a dangerous question, the kind that made you think of the enemy as something other than a target, the kind that made everything harder. "I try not to," I said finally. Danny nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." Morning came with the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph, gray and flat and endless. I'd managed to sleep maybe an hour, curled up against the frozen wall of the foxhole with my coat pulled tight. When I woke, Danny was already up, moving around quietly, checking his gear. That's when I pulled out the can of beans. It wasn't much. A small tin I'd been saving, part of my sea rations from 2 days before. I'd been rationing my food carefully, trying to make it last. But that morning, I was too hungry to care anymore. I set up a small fire using a few scraps of wood and a piece of torn cardboard, coaxing it to life with frozen fingers until I had enough heat to warm the can. The smell of beans cooking was better than anything I'd experienced in weeks. It was the smell of something normal, something that reminded you there was a world beyond this frozen hillside where people sat at tables and ate warm meals and didn't think twice about it. Danny watched me from across the foxhole. I could see he was hungry too, could see it in the way his eyes followed the can, in the way he swallowed. "You want some?" I asked. He shook his head. "You need it. We both need it." He hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks. I was dividing the beans between us, using my spoon to scrape out half into Danny's mess kit, when I heard the sound, a sharp crack, like a branch breaking, coming from somewhere below our position. I froze. Danny's hand went to his rifle. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I saw him. A figure, maybe 50 yards down the slope, moving slowly through the snow. He was wearing a quilted jacket, the kind the Chinese soldiers wore, and he was limping badly, favoring his left leg. As he got closer, I could see his face was pale, almost gray, and his hands were empty. "Contact," Danny whispered, his voice tight. "Hold on," I said. The figure stopped. He'd seen us. He stood there in the snow, swaying slightly, and I realized he wasn't armed. His hands were out at his sides, palms forward, in a gesture that needed no translation. "He's not carrying a weapon," I said. "Could be a trick. Could be." We watched him, he watched us. The moment stretched out, fragile as ice. Then he did something I didn't expect. He pointed at his mouth, then at his stomach, then made a slow, careful gesture that looked like he was eating. He was hungry, maybe starving, and he was asking us for food. "Jesus," Danny breathed. My hand was still holding the can of warm beans. I looked down at them, then back at the soldier. He was young, maybe younger than me. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken deep, and even from 50 yards away I could see he was shaking. I should have shot him. That's what I was supposed to do. He was the enemy. He was Chinese or North Korean, and we were at war, and the rules were simple. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the singing from the night before. Maybe it was the way he stood there, unarmed and broken, asking for the one thing I had to give. Maybe it was just that I was tired of all of it. The killing, the cold, the senselessness of it all. I stood up slowly, holding the can. "What are you doing?" Danny hissed. "I don't know." I took a step toward the edge of the foxhole. The soldier below tensed but didn't move. I held up the can so he could see it, then pointed at him. His eyes widened. I was about to call out to tell him to come closer when I heard the laughter. It came from off to my left, from the next foxhole over where Stevens and Martinez were dug in. Stevens was standing up, watching the scene, and he was laughing. A hard, cruel sound that cut through the frozen air like broken glass. "You going to feed the gook, Marsh?" Stevens shouted. "That what you're doing? Going to have a tea party with the enemy?" Martinez joined in, his voice sharp with mockery. "Maybe invite him up here. Share your blanket too. Keep each other warm." The soldier below us looked from me to Stevens, confusion crossing his face. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the laughter. I saw it happen in his eyes, the hope draining away, replaced by something else. Shame, maybe, or resignation. He lowered his hands slowly, and his face went blank, the way faces do when you stop expecting anything good from the world. "Come on," I said, ignoring Stevens. I held out the can again. "Come on, it's okay." But it wasn't okay. The laughter had poisoned it. What might have been a simple act of mercy had become something else. A joke. A mockery, a reminder of which side had food and which side was starving. The soldier took a step backward, then another. He was retreating, his dignity in tatters, and I felt something break inside my chest watching him go. That's when Danny stood up beside me. He didn't say anything. He just reached into his pack and pulled out his own rations. 2 cans of chocolate bar, a packet of crackers, everything he had. He held them up so the soldier could see. Then he started walking forward, out of the foxhole, down the slope toward the enemy soldier. "Chen!" Stevens shouted. "What the hell are you doing?" Danny ignored him. He kept walking, slow and steady, his arms out, holding the food like an offering. The soldier below watched him come, frozen in place, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. I grabbed my own pack and followed Danny. I couldn't let him go alone. Behind us, Stevens was still shouting, and I could hear Lieutenant Crawford yelling for us to get back. But it all seemed distant and unimportant. What mattered was Danny walking through the snow toward a starving enemy soldier with food in his hands. When we got close, maybe 10 feet away, Danny stopped. He set the rations down in the snow, carefully arranging them so the soldier could see what each one was. Then he took a step back. The soldier stared at the food. His hands were shaking harder now, and I realized he might be crying, though it was hard to tell in the cold. Slowly, carefully, he moved forward and knelt in the snow. He picked up one of the cans, then looked up at Danny. "Xiexia," he said softly, "thank you." Danny nodded. "You're welcome." The soldier gathered the food into his arms, holding it like treasure. Then he did something that made my throat close up. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph. He held it out to Danny, his hand trembling. Danny took it carefully. It was a picture of a woman and a small child, standing in front of a simple house. The woman was smiling. The child was laughing. The soldier pointed at the photo, then at himself. Then he pressed his hand over his heart. "His family," Danny said quietly. The soldier nodded. He pointed at the photo again, then gestured at the mountains behind him, in the direction of China. He said something in Chinese, fast and urgent, and even though I couldn't understand the words, I understood the meaning he was telling us about them, about the people he'd left behind, about the reason he was here, cold and hungry and so far from home. Then he reached out and took Danny's hand. He held it for a moment, this enemy soldier, holding the hand of a Chinese-American private in the United States Army, and something passed between them that I couldn't name. Recognition? Maybe. Or just the simple acknowledgement that they were both human, both far from home, both caught in something bigger and more terrible than either of them could control. He let go of Danny's hand and stepped back. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect, then turned and started walking back toward his lines, the food clutched in his arms. We watched him go. Danny was still holding the photograph. "Come on," I said quietly. "We need to get back before Crawford has our heads." We walked back up the slope in silence. Stevens and Martinez had stopped laughing. In fact, no one said anything as we climbed back into the foxhole. Even Crawford, who I expected to tear into us, just shook his head and turned away. But I knew what was coming. Word would spread. Stories would get told. Danny and I had just fed the enemy, given aid and comfort to the other side, and in a war like this, where everything was confused and motivations were questioned and loyalties were tested, that kind of thing didn't just go away. That night, the temperature dropped even further. It was so cold that water froze inside our canteens. So cold that talking took effort because your jaw got stiff. Danny and I sat in our foxhole, not saying much, both of us wrapped in every piece of clothing we owned. Around 9 o'clock, we heard the mortars start up. They came from the Chinese positions across the valley, arcing through the darkness, and for 20 minutes our world became nothing but explosions and screaming and the desperate scramble to stay alive. I pressed myself against the frozen earth and prayed while the ground shook and dirt rained down and the sound swallowed everything. When it stopped, the silence was worse than the noise. That's how you knew it was bad, when the silence after a barrage felt heavier than the explosions themselves. "Sound off!" Crawford shouted into the darkness. "Every position, sound off!" One by one, voices called back. First position, clear. Second position, clear. Third position, clear. Then nothing. "Fourth position!" Crawford shouted. "Stevens, Martinez, sound off." Silence. "Marsh, Chen, get over there and check it out." We moved through the darkness carefully, weapons ready, expecting the worst. The fourth position was only 30 yards from ours, but in the blackness it felt like miles. When we got there, I smelled it before I saw it. Smoke and something else, something burned. Stevens was dead. A direct hit had landed right in their foxhole, and there wasn't much left to identify except his dog tags. Martinez was alive, but just barely. He was lying on his back, his legs twisted at wrong angles, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "I got him," Danny said, dropping down beside Martinez. "Go get the medic." I ran. By the time I got back with Doc Hamilton, Martinez had lost consciousness. Doc worked on him by flashlight while the rest of us stood around trying not to look, trying not to think about how easily it could have been any of us. "He's not going to make it to morning if we don't get him out of here," Doc said finally. "He needs a field hospital. Can't call for evacuation until daylight," Crawford said. "Too dangerous. He won't last until daylight." Crawford was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Danny and me. "You two, you're going to carry him down to the aid station. It's about 2 miles through the valley. Stay low, stay quiet, and for God's sake, don't get yourselves killed." "Sir," Danny said, "with respect, going through the valley at night, I know what I'm asking." Crawford cut him off. "But it's his only chance. You want to stay here and watch him die. That's your choice. But I'm not making that choice for him." Danny looked at me. I looked at Martinez, unconscious and bleeding. And I thought about his wife back in Texas. About the letters he'd showed me with pictures of their baby girl. I thought about Stevens, who'd been laughing at us that morning, and was now just a name that would get added to a list. "We'll do it," I said. We fashioned a stretcher out of branches and a poncho, loaded Martinez onto it as carefully as we could, and started down the hill. The valley was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face, and every step felt like walking off a cliff. Danny took the front of the stretcher, I took the back, and we moved as quickly as we dared through the frozen darkness. The first mile was just hard. The second mile became something else entirely. We were halfway across the valley when I heard it. Movement to our right. The soft crunch of boots in snow. I froze. Danny heard it too. We set down the stretcher as quietly as we could and crouched in the darkness, our rifles ready, waiting. A figure emerged from the shadows, then another, and another. Chinese soldiers, maybe 5 or 6 of them, moving through the valley on patrol. They were close enough that I could hear them breathing, could hear the soft murmur of their voices. If they found us, we were dead. There was no way we could fight them off and protect Martinez at the same time. All we could do was stay absolutely still and pray they passed by without seeing us. They were almost level with us when one of them stopped. He said something to the others, and they all stopped. My finger tightened on the trigger of my rifle. This was it. We'd been spotted. Then a voice spoke out of the darkness. A single word in Chinese, sharp and urgent. The soldiers turned toward the sound. One of them responded, his voice questioning. The first voice spoke again, and this time I recognized something in the cadence, something familiar. The soldiers moved away from us, heading toward the voice. Within seconds, they disappeared back into the darkness, and we were alone again. Danny and I didn't move for a long time. We just crouched there in the snow, listening to our hearts pound, trying to understand what had just happened. "Someone called them away from us," Danny whispered finally. "Yeah." "Who?" I thought about the soldier we'd fed that morning, about his hollow face and his trembling hands, about the photograph of his family, about the way he'd held Danny's hand. "I don't know," I said, but I was lying. I knew. We picked up the stretcher and kept moving. We didn't talk about it. What was there to say? That an enemy soldier had maybe saved our lives? That someone we were supposed to kill had returned a kindness we'd shown him that morning? In the logic of war, it didn't make sense, but then again, nothing about this war made sense anymore. We reached the aid station 20 minutes later. Martinez was still breathing, still alive, and that was all that mattered. The medics took him from us and disappeared into a tent, and Danny and I stood outside in the darkness, exhausted and shaking and alive. "We should head back," I said. Danny nodded. But before we started walking, he pulled out that photograph the soldier had given him. He looked at it for a long moment in the dim light from the aid station tent. "You think he's still out there?" Danny asked quietly. "I don't know." "You think we'll see him again?" "I don't know that either." Danny carefully folded the photograph and put it back in his pocket. "I hope he makes it home," he said. "I hope he gets back to them." "Yeah, me too." We never saw that soldier again. I don't know if he survived the war. I don't know if he made it home to the woman and child in the photograph. I don't know his name or his story or anything about him except that one morning he was hungry and we fed him, and that night he might have saved our lives. Martinez survived. He lost his left leg, but he lived. He went back to Texas and raised his daughter and sent me a Christmas card every year for the next 40 years. Stevens was buried in a military cemetery in Busan. His mother came to the funeral. I'll never forget the sound she made when they handed her the folded flag. Danny and I were transferred to different units a week after that night in the valley. The last time I saw him was at a staging area in Seoul, and we didn't talk about what had happened. We didn't need to. We just shook hands and wished each other luck, and that was that. I came home in 1952, got a job, got married, had kids, lived a normal life. But I never forgot that morning in the foxhole, or the soldier who walked up out of the frozen valley asking for food. I never forgot the laughter or the shame in his eyes, or the way Danny just stood up and walked toward him without hesitation. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that moment, about the choice we made to feed him instead of shooting him, about whether it mattered in the larger scheme of the war, whether it changed anything at all, and I think about the voice in the darkness that called those Chinese soldiers away from us, giving us time to save Martinez's life. The thing about war is that we tell ourselves stories to make it make sense. We talk about good guys and bad guys, about heroes and villains, about causes worth dying for. But down in the frozen valleys, in the moments between the shooting, it's never that simple. It's just men, cold and hungry and afraid, trying to survive until morning, trying to hold on to something human in a place designed to strip humanity away. I don't know if what we did was right or wrong. I don't know if it was brave or stupid or both. All I know is that for one brief moment, in the middle of a war that made no sense, 3 men chose to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Maybe that's the only victory worth having. Danny Chen died in 2003. I went to his funeral in San Francisco. His family had kept that photograph all those years, and his daughter told me that he used to take it out sometimes and look at it, but he never talked about where it came from. She asked me if I knew the story. I told her I did, but I didn't tell her all of it. Some things are too complicated to explain. Some things you had to be there to understand. I'm 76 years old now. The Korea War ended 64 years ago. Most of the men I served with are gone. The world has changed in ways I couldn't have imagined back then. Fought wars I never dreamed of. Made peace with enemies that seemed eternal. But I still remember the cold. I still remember the silence. And I still remember the morning a starving soldier walked out of the frozen valley and asked us for food. And the sound of laughter that tried to turn mercy into mockery. I remember the way Danny Chen stood up and walked toward him anyway. I remember the weight of that moment, balanced on a knife's edge between cruelty and compassion, between seeing the enemy as something less than human, or recognizing him as exactly what he was. A man far from home, a man with a family, a man trying to survive. I don't know what happened to that soldier. I don't know if he made it back to the woman and child in the photograph, but I hope he did. I hope he lived long enough to hold them again, to tell them about the war, to explain why he was gone for so long. And I hope, somewhere in that story, he remembered the 2 American soldiers who fed him when he was hungry. Not because we were heroes, but because in that moment, in the frozen silence of war, it was the only human thing to do. That's what I think about now, in the quiet hours. Not the battles we won or lost, not the ground we took or gave up, but the small moments when we had a choice between cruelty and kindness, between revenge and mercy, between seeing the other side as monsters or recognizing them as mirrors of ourselves. The war taught me how to kill, but that morning in the foxhole taught me something else. It taught me that even in the darkest places, even in the heart of violence and hatred, there's still room for compassion. There's still space for humanity, and sometimes that matters more than victory. I've carried that lesson for more than 60 years. It sustained me through times when the world seemed dark, through moments when I was tempted to see enemies instead of people, through all the small wars we wage against each other in our daily lives. And I've carried that photograph too. Danny's daughter gave it to me at his funeral. She said he would have wanted me to have it. It sits on my desk now, faded and worn, showing a woman and child I never met, standing in front of a house I'll never see, in a country that was once our enemy and is now something more complicated than that. I look at it sometimes and I wonder if that soldier is looking at a copy of the same photograph somewhere, thinking about his family, thinking about the war, thinking about the 2 American soldiers who gave him food when he was starving. I wonder if he remembers the laughter too. The sound of mockery that tried to poison an act of mercy. And I wonder if he remembers what happened after that. The silence, the choice, the moment when everything could have gone one way and went another instead. I'll never know the answers to those questions. The war is too far behind us now, and too much has changed. But that's okay. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some moments are meant to stay suspended in time, unresolved and perfect in their ambiguity. What I do know is this. On a frozen morning in January 1951, in a valley in Korea, a simple act of kindness broke through the hatred and the violence, if only for a moment. And in that moment, 3 men, 2 Americans and 1 Chinese soldier, recognized each other as human beings. They saw past the uniforms and the flags and the orders, and they chose compassion over cruelty. That choice didn't end the war. It didn't bring peace or change history or save anyone except maybe Martinez, and even that's uncertain. But it changed me. It changed Danny. And I believe it changed that soldier too, whoever he was, wherever he ended up. Because in the end, War isn't won or lost in the grand movements of armies or the strategies of generals. It's won or lost in the small moments, in the choices we make when no one is looking, in the spaces between the violence where we decide who we want to be. And that morning, freezing in a foxhole with my can of warm beans, I chose to be someone who feeds the hungry, even if they're supposed to be my enemy. Danny chose to walk toward danger with his arms full of food and his heart full of courage. And somewhere in the frozen valley, an enemy soldier chose to warn us away from a patrol that would have killed us. Those choices didn't make sense in the logic of war. They were inefficient, illogical, even dangerous. But they were human and in a place designed to strip away our humanity that mattered more than anything else. So when people ask me about Korea, about the war, about what it was like, I tell them this story, not because it's heroic or inspiring or shows us in some perfect light, but because it's true, because it happened. And because sometimes, even in the darkest places, people surprise you. They choose mercy over revenge. They choose compassion over cruelty. They choose to see enemies as human beings. And those choices, small as they are, brief as they are, forgotten as they are in the larger sweep of history, those choices matter. They're the ones I remember when everything else has faded, when the names of the battles have blurred together, and the strategic objectives have been forgotten, and the reasons we fought have become complicated and unclear. I remember the cold, I remember the silence, and I remember the morning mercy broke through, if only for a moment, if only for 3 men in a frozen valley, if only long enough to prove that even in war, we're still capable of being human. That's the story. That's what happened. And more than 70 years later, it still haunts me. Not with regret or sorrow, but with a strange kind of hope. The hope that somewhere, somehow, that soldier made it home, that he held his family again, that he told them about the 2 American soldiers who gave him food when he was starving. And maybe, just maybe, he wondered about us the same way we wondered about him. 2 sides of the same war, separated by language and ideology and all the vast machinery of conflict, connected for one brief moment by the simplest of human acts. A meal shared, a hand held, a life saved in return for a kindness given. That's what I think about now in these quiet years. Not the grand narratives or the historical significance or the lessons learned, but the simple human moment when we chose to be kind instead of cruel, and the way that moment rippled forward through time, touching lives we'll never know, changing things in ways we can't measure. The war is over now, has been for a long time, but that moment lives on in my memory, in the photograph on my desk, in the story I tell when people ask, and maybe, if I'm lucky, in the memory of a soldier I never met, whose name I never learned, who walked out of the frozen valley one morning and changed my life forever. Sometimes the stories that stay with us aren't the ones with clear heroes and villains. They're the ones that remind us that even in our darkest hours, we have a choice. We can choose to see the humanity in others, even when everything around us says not to. We can choose compassion when it would be easier to choose cruelty. And sometimes that choice changes everything. This story, like so many from those frozen mountains, reminds us that the greatest acts of courage aren't always the ones that make the history books. Sometimes they're as simple as sharing a meal with someone who's hungry, or walking toward danger when everyone else is walking away. We'd love to hear what you think. Did this story move you? Do you have thoughts about the choices these men made? Drop a comment below and share your perspective. And if you found meaning in this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories like this one, stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, because we believe they matter. They remind us of who we are and who we can choose to be. Thanks for listening. And remember, the small choices we make, the moments when we decide to be kind instead of cruel, to see people instead of enemies, those are the moments that define us. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.